Hi everyone. We are on to Chapter 5, which focuses on Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, I am going to admit that I am not as well versed in Section 504 as I am in IDEA. So we'll kind of just briefly go through this. It's not a law that you need to really focus on since it's more a general education law, but it does include kids also on IDEA. So we will kind of go through this quickly. It was signed by President Nixon in 1973, and it was a little bit difficulty finding it for educators because it was found within a labor statute called the Rehabilitation Act. When it was originally proposed, it was as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, looking at the anti-discrimination laws for disabilities. But it seemed to have a better fit within the Rehabilitation Act since that was already federally funded for programs for people with disabilities. So that's why it was placed within the Rehabilitation Act instead of the Civil Rights Act. But it was written in the same way, those using the same anti-discrimination language as is found in the anti-civil right or in the Civil Rights Act for race and gender. Um, there was a little bit of lag in writing the regulations um, for this particular law, and that was mostly due to political reasons. There was a changeover in administration, and just for political reasons, it was kind of put on the back burner until 1977. So 4 years later, after the law was written, the regulations came on how to interpret that law. Um, so let's go right on to the definition and looking a little bit more clearly at this law. So, like I said, it was a civil rights law, and they wanted to prohibit by law the discrimination of people with disabilities in federally funded programs. So, discrimination here means meaning the unequal treatment of people with disabilities based solely on their disability. And so that was for any program that was assisted by the federal government, which could include grants and loans when they had contracts with the federal government, could be getting money from the government, but also services or property from the government. So that includes, as we are focusing in on, is schools. So this law not only protected students with disabilities, but parents with disabilities as well as employees. So it's a little more broad than IDEA, where IDEA only covers that birth through 21. Now we're looking at beyond that, and in higher education and also in the work world. So it also extends beyond the school day to after school programs, extracurricular activities, and all of those things, not just the academic day during school. Well, it's only within the last decade that this law has really gotten more attention. And this is probably due to, as you can see in the slide there is no money attached to this particular law. Whereas, IDEA has the money and backing with the grants to schools to carry it out. But Section 504 has no money attached to it. Um, but the way there has been more attention to this is through parents with students with disabilities, that especially that those that weren't recognized under IDEA, so they didn't qualify for special education and still had needs and for accommodations within the school. So that produced more litigation, and this litigation under Section 504 is handled through the Office of Civil Rights, or you might hear it referred to as OCR. So once this litigation comes up, now we have attorneys' fees and dollar signs, and so educators were forced to pay more attention to this Section 504, and seeing lots and lots more cases tried in the civil rights court. So now let's go in and look at this definition of Section 504. So this definition includes any person who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of such person's major life activities. I'm just going to go through this briefly now and kind of break it down more specifically as we go on. The second part is that they have a record of such an impairment, or thirdly, is regarded as having such an impairment. So now let's look at a little bit more specifically what that means. So a physical or mental impairment is the first part in that definition. By physical, that could mean a whole host of things. Some of the things they specifically list in the definition are things such as arthritis, asthma, deafness, blindness, diabetes, Crohn's disease, MS, paralysis, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, cardiac problems, Tourette syndrome, and it goes on and on. Anything that physically affects the body. But then the other piece of that is also a mental impairment, which could be any mental illness, including that mental retardation, those cognitive disabilities, and learning disabilities. So anything that, is working with that neurological system. So you need to have an impairment, either physical or mental. And that impairment has to substantially limit a major life activity. So that's the next part on the slide. Major life activities include caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, learning, working, eating, sleeping, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and the operation of major bodily functions. So anything, that you need to live. So you're going to have this physical or mental impairment that limits these major life activities. Now the third part there is substantially limits. Now this is a little unclear. There's no specific definition on what substantially limits means. So it is focused on by the team on an individualized basis on what if it's substantially limiting those major life activities. Now in 2008, the government did provide a little guidance on how to define substantially limits, and they gave the guidance that life activities are restricted as to the conditions, manner, or duration under which they can be performed in comparison to most people. So it gives you a little bit more understanding of what substantial might mean. But it just gives the team a little bit more leeway to make that determination. So that's kind of that first piece of the definition. Now the next two pieces has a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having such an impairment don't typically apply to schools as much as they do to higher education and employment. But record of such impairment is a student who once had a disability that no longer does, may be discriminated against because of that past disability, or students who have been incorrectly classified as being disabled. Now the next part is regarded as having an impairment, and this is students are protected if they do not actually have a disability, but are regarded as having one. This could be a student who might have some minor disabilities or no disability at all, but that might be, they might have that diagnosis, but it isn't limiting them, their major life activity, or it's not substantially limiting them. It's just kind of a mild effect on them. So like I said, they don't really refer much to us in elementary and secondary schools, but there are situations where that might be. Students, in order to receive services under Section 504, must currently be affected by their disability in a substantial way to receive that free appropriate public education under Section 504. So we can't look at something in the past or where, before they were having behavior problems back in third grade And now there's been intervention, and they have kind of turned that around. And now in fourth grade, you can't discriminate them due to that past disability, those behavior difficulties. So you can't say, okay, well, in third grade, you had all these problems, so there's no way we're going to let you on this field trip in fourth grade because of that past behavior. If there's been improvements, that would be discriminatory. So that would be an example of how it would apply in a school. So as you can see, compared to IDEA, we have those 13 categories where students can be identified as a student with a disability. In Section 504, that definition is much broader, and we can see that this can cover many more people. And we kind of look at those kids that maybe were tested, evaluated for special education, and they didn't qualify. This would give them another option to get those accommodations they may need. Let's see. So we look at extracurricular activities as well as falling under this Section 504, and this can get kind of tricky when kids are getting to that secondary level and trying out for sports. Just have to make sure in the school that they have a fair chance. So let's say that we have a student with ADHD, and that student tries out for the basketball team. So this student had the skills to make the team. They were a good basketball player. But then when it comes to the games, they're not being played because the coach says that student really couldn't handle it due to their ADHD, inattention, whatever. So in that situation, that would be discrimination because the student tried out, had the skills, made the team. They should get the opportunity to play in the game as well. They may need some accommodations to level that playing field, but they should still get that right to play in the games because they met everything else that was required by other players. Also, if a student is cut from the team, it has to be due to that skill level, not just because they have a disability. So just, everybody has that fair chance to try out and make the team due to the skill. There's a whole Dear Colleague letter that is really great if you're interested in more about extracurricular activities and 504 and how that works out. So it's dated January 25th of 2013 by the U.S. Department of Education. So if you're interested in that, I can either get that to you or you can look that up. Now let's go on and see who is covered by Section 504. On this slide you can see 3 circles. So we're going to look at the outermost circle is going to be all students within the school. Then as you go in further, we have the next circle, and that is going to be students in the school who meet the Section 504 definition of a disability, but they aren't included under IDEA. So you can see that's a few more students. And then the very center of that circle, the fewest number of students, are the students who meet the definition for IDEA, for a disability. They are eligible for special education, but they're also covered under Section 504. They're within that other circle. So it's fewer students in the IDEA, but then we can also service a few more students in that next circle under Section 504. Just a little visual there to kind of help you understand that it surely gets tricky when you're looking at dual coverage of IDEA and Section 504. But we have these 2 requirements here. We have a comparability requirement, and that means that individuals with disabilities have the equal opportunity to benefit from the school's academic or non-academic programming. So here we're going to look at, offering classes to all students, and if a student has a disability, We need to also offer them that program, but in order for them to succeed within that program, we may have to offer them some accommodations. And so that's where that Section 504 plan, accommodation plan, comes into play to allow them access to the programs that they may not be able to be successful with without those accommodations. We also have what's called the Commensurate Opportunity Standard. Here we must provide students with disabilities programming, aid, benefit, or service equally effective as offered to non-disabled. And this is where we're looking at that segregation. We would only segregate students if that it was necessary to their programming. Okay. Let me go on. The next area we're looking here are the principles that are included in that Section 504. And the first being the protection from discrimination. So we have all sorts of things that we need to think about in order to not discriminate students with disabilities. We need to look at the physical accessibility for them. What can we do to accommodate their physical needs? This might be looking at students in wheelchairs. Do we offer, say they're going to take a science class. The science class is located on the second floor of the building. Do we have access for that student to get to that class? Or do we need to move the class so that they have access to the class? Is there an elevator? Is there ramps for the student to get to that second floor? If not, then the class probably needs to be moved to another floor. So, that kind of goes into, that facility and physical access. We also need program access. Do they have access to all the programs that are offered in the school? Not physically, but are there accommodations that need to be made so that they're able to take, say, is it algebra or chemistry? When we're looking at accommodations, we need to make sure that they're reasonable. I think of this especially in higher ed. When we have a program where we are teaching students a career, and we want to make sure that we aren't doing unreasonable accommodations so that they aren't able to perform that job out in the workforce. So, are those accommodations reasonable? Are we not accommodating too much? If we need to accommodate too much, then we maybe need to look at IDEA, where they can get more of what they need in a separate type of program. Are they in comparable facilities? Are we avoiding discrimination? And then also it's broad looking into those extracurricular activities as well, which we already kind of touched on. Some more principles of Section 504 is that we're also looking in a school that students need to be offered a free, appropriate public education. So that includes not only their education, but those related services that we looked at, the OT, the PT, speech. Do they need that to access that education at no charge? Which gets a little tricky in school districts as well. They might be hesitant to offer those related services because if you remember, we said at the beginning that Section 504 comes with no funding. So a student on an IEP under IDEA, we would have the funding to pay for those therapies. Whereas if a student does not qualify and is on a Section 504 plan, but we feel needs that OT services, then that has to be paid through the general education fund at the school district's expense. And it gets very spendy. So that's where we have a little trouble with this Section 504. And that, sometimes in my experience, schools aren't really willing to put students on that accommodation plan and really want them more to qualify under IDEA where those funds are available. But all in all, we need to think what's best for students because we don't want to get into litigation over these things. Another principle is evaluation and placement procedures. We also look at procedural safeguards under 504, as well as educational obligations. What's part of this plan? And we'll get more specifically into those as we go on. So, Zirkle, who writes in 2014, the matter of evaluation has been the subject of more OCR investigations than any other requirement in Section 504. So when we're looking at, how students are going to qualify here, that's an area we really need to pay attention to, that evaluation. Also, OCR, when it looks at those procedural safeguards, they recommend using the same safeguards that are found in IDEA, but does not require that. They just feel that that's a very good process to follow. So, when you are considering referring a student for services under Section 504, who are those students that we should be looking at? Because we also have that child find requirement under 504 here. So, when we're doing child find for IDEA, we're also looking for students with disabilities who may qualify under Section 504. So we're going to look for students who have an impairment that substantially limits major life activities, maybe students with serious academic problems, serious behavior problems, maybe a student transfers from another school district that's already on a Section 504 plan, maybe a student who is referred for special education, but the decision was made not to evaluate at this time. They may be eligible under Section 504. Like we said before, a student who was referred for special education, but the decision was made that he or she was not eligible for services, they would be a recommendation for a 504. Looking at a student considered for grade retention, or a student who's not benefiting from instruction, a student who returns to school following a serious illness or injury. I've had this experience. We've had a student who experienced a brain injury from a car accident and really had some issues with memory, impulse control, decision making. He also missed a fair amount of school due to this accident. So we really had to look, is this student eligible under IDEA, or is it more of a Section 504 issue? And all in the end, they did determine that he did qualify for an IEP due to a traumatic brain injury resulting from this car accident, and was placed under IDEA, which we thought was a better fit for him. But that would be an example of experiencing an injury and needing something after that. Sometimes we see students with diabetes that need that accommodation plan to check their blood sugar and administer insulin, those types of things we see frequently in the school. We might have a student that's referred by their parent, someone who has a chronic health condition, like I said, that diabetes or ADHD. Sometimes dyslexia can fall under here as well at the moment. Maybe a student who's a potential dropout, or is exiting from special education but yet still needs a little support to make that transition. There are other things listed there, but those are some ideas to kind of spark for you as a special educator. If you're exiting a student, you might suggest 504 would be a good plan, or someone who didn't qualify. Maybe should we look at a 504 accommodation plan? Now, generally, that is supposed to be the responsibility of the 504 coordinator in your school, and hopefully it's not the special education teacher that becomes that 504 coordinator, because they really do need to be separate. A lot of times you might see the school counselor as your 504 coordinator. It might be an administrator is the 504 coordinator. Kind of look and see who is that person in your school that is in charge of this process. So we look at educational obligations. So what in the school does this look like? Uh, so like I said before, we need to look at that identification with that annual child fine, and that could be incorporated right with your other child fine that we've talked about. Next, we need to evaluate those students to find out, is that student eligible, and what programming is needed to give them a free appropriate education. Now, a medical diagnosis is not required to qualify under Section 504. You need to have a physical or mental impairment, but that does not need to be a medical diagnosis. If you would require that or want that, it should not be at the parental expense. It should be at the expense of the school district. If they already have that diagnosis, by all means, just have the parents bring that in, and that can help support the definition of that physical or mental impairment. Also important to note that in that evaluation phase, like in IDEA where parents have the right to get that independent evaluation at public expense, they do not have that right here in Section 504. There are also no specific timelines, and it's kind of stated that students with our limited English, they do not qualify since their language barrier is not a physical or mental impairment. Also, if you have a parent that kind of revokes their special education services under IDEA, they essentially are also revoking the Section 504 as well. So, if the student qualifies under IDEA, then that's where those services need to happen. You can't just ask for a 504 plan, because obviously what their needs are greater and are going to require that financial assistance. So we want to, it's kind of a all or nothing here. The third obligation here is educational programming. So there are, a whole host of accommodations that can be provided for students. And, as we go to the next slide, we can see a lot of the classroom modifications, auxiliary aids and devices that might be used, or some academic adjustments that can be made. And there's a whole list of things. And also, if you go to the guides that are available through our state, they also have lots of good lists of suggestions that can be put on these plans. So it's not called an IEP, but it's an individual accommodation plan is what it's called under Section 504. There are also sample plans that that the state has prepared, and you can find those under the resource tab on the LMS. After that programming, we put the placement. We also look at that least restrictive environment. We want them with their peers at the maximum amount possible, just like under IDEA. And then the fifth part is reevaluation. 3-year reevaluation is not required under Section 504 as it is in IDEA, but you want to periodically look at that and reevaluate before any significant change in placement. So that's a little bit different. The plan is supposed to be looked at annually, like an IEP, just to make any updates as you move on to the next grade level. Okay, so lastly, we're going to look at what that process looks like. From our text on page 102, I just recreated this chart here, and we look at, a student is referred for services under Section 504. Then our next decision is, should the student be evaluated? If we say no, then the student is not eligible. If we say yes, then yes, the student is eligible. Or you evaluate and find that the student is eligible if they have a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity in a substantial way. Then the student's eligible. Then we develop that Section 504 plan and communicate that to teachers and staff, and then monitor the implementation of that. At any point in here, parents can file a grievance with the school, and there's kind of that mediation process to try to clear up the problem, with between the school and the party. But if that can't be solved, then we have what we have the OCR comes in and does an investigation, and they will come on site and look at all the documentation and interview the staff. And if a violation is found, the district is required to make a plan to correct it. And then the parents are notified of that. If they refuse to make any correction, then they are at the risk of getting their federal funds taken away because they are not following these anti-discrimination laws. They can file for a due process hearing through Section 504 through that OCR, and it can, go file for suit in federal court as well. And like I said before, that's kind of an emergent trend in litigation, is to use Section 504 in cases where they're seeking that monetary damages for violations of even IDEA. And, according to Weatherly in 2014, this may be due to the availability of monetary damages under Section 504, where no monetary damages are available under IDEA. So you have, attorney's fees and compensatory damages, reimbursement for costs incurred, such as tuition, and the possibility of monetary awards for damages. So, more money available. But in this case, the district personnel must have made a grave and deliberate error to award those parents those monetary damages. So hopefully we will all stay away from that. So that is just a very quick, brief review of Section 504. You can consult your text for more information and those documents I put on the resource page. But that just gives us, a little bit of taste of that. We really want to focus in on that IDEA. So until next time, bye.